Told you guys I'd follow up with a little bit on these suspension systems. Now again, we're not experts on suspension systems. I'm going to show you what we learned during our swap. So this is a pretty standard build here. Well, actually it's an LT4, but it's going to be an awesome build. Guy's got some Dynatracs, looks like a 60 in the front. He's got, it looks like Evo coilover suspension, which works well again. We have an LT4 here, like I said, with a new GM 8090 transmission. This customer chose to go with the 8090 transmission because it is a little bit stronger than the 10-speed, but I think they're both great transmissions. So let's take a look. This has our standard setup. We have our heavy-duty four-wheel drive dual stud GM mount with the stock GM transfer case adapter. This is our adjustable transmission plate. You can see it's adjustable both side to side and front to rear. Now you will notice that this cross member drops down and then goes across and goes back up. And that's important because this transmission has to clear the body. And if you were to make a flat cross member, it's going to raise this transmission up and it's going to smash into the tunnel. Now it's a compromise because a lot of guys want ground clearance. So if we look here, I think you can see how far this drops below the frame rail. Now it would be ideal to move all this above the frame rail, but then we're getting into the body. So you'll notice we're running our easy mounts, and guys, our easy mounts not only are attached here and there, but they're also attached on the bottom to box them in. So make sure you're using those lower mounts if you're using our easy mounts. We've got another cross member with a hoop, cross member with a hoop, cross member with somewhat of a hoop, another cross member, and our fuel tanks over here. Now this hoop, let me get behind it, is offset to the passenger side, as you can see. It's offset about 1 5/8 inches. That's where Chrysler puts it. You can see the whole powertrain is offset a little bit. Now that's going to come into play when we have our Elite suspension package because we're running a 3-link. You will notice that back here we're running a 4-link, but we're running them outboard just like Chrysler does. Now this isn't like Chrysler, meaning this these control arm pickup points have been added later on. This actually needs to be cleaned up. Way too much rust there. We're going to have to clean that up. But because these control arms are relatively parallel with the frame, that means that this axle can swing side to side with not a lot of force. So that's why you got a track bar. What this track bar does, this track bar, and it's adjustable as you can see, is going to keep this axle from moving side to side. So we got our rear frame, cross member 1, cross member 2, cross member 3, cross member 4, and then our cross member under the engine. And if you want a quick look at that with the engine out, so here's the stock pickup points on the stock chassis. You'll notice that they're inboard here. Unfortunately, this guy is running drop brackets, as you can see. Not a big fan of that because all we're really doing is lowering the suspension pickup points. If you look at this, all we're doing is dropping these down, and that's raising the vehicle, but it's not really doing a whole lot for articulation, travel, etc. It's just raising the roll center, in my opinion. Now, as usual, we don't make any modifications to the frame. So we keep the stock frame buckets, stock cross member, and here's a good look at it. Notice how it dips down, goes across and comes back up, gives that transmission enough clearance. And we're not just talking about LSs or LTs, we're talking about Hemis and even the stock transmission. So we got our offset hoops, and you'll notice back here the fuel tank, which is about 23 gallons, is tucked away in the frame, and that's one of the reasons that we have to run these control arms on the outside of the frame, is so we can fit this tank. Now, in order for the GenRight Elite chassis to get the 4-link and eliminate this track bar, we got to get rid of this fuel tank and move it to the back. Then we can do a proper 4-link setup, and let's show you that. So here we have the mighty LT1. Obviously we got hydraulics. We have a core transmission on here just for mock-up purposes, and you'll notice that when we put this where we want it to be, this GenRight cross member is in a completely different place. Now you'll notice that this cross member goes straight across, and our long arms are attached to that. Now this is a 3-link, this isn't a 4-link. So we got a link here in the bottom, a link over there in the bottom, and then we have our upper link over here, which is only on one side, and that's attached to the differential. So we have built all this here and eliminated all those cross members we talked about. We built this cross member to have a suspension pickup point for the lower control arms, and you'll notice that these arms are splayed. The reason is now we don't have to run a track bar. So when this goes up and down, that axle is going to go up and down straight. Now there's Watts links and other links that you can use rather than just a simple track bar, but simple track bar is proven. The axle doesn't move that much. It's simple and reliable. But this is definitely a more purist approach at the suspension, at the cost of lots and lots of labor. There is no fuel tank here. We got our fuel tank back here, and we'll talk about that in a second, but let's talk about this first. So we're going to move this engine forward, and we're going to put this right into the middle of this cross member, and you'll see that having this flat belly now with skids, we're going to have skids going across here. You picked up a couple inches of clearance. Now you're not going to high center as easy. What determines your clearance in the front is going to be the size of your tire to the bottom of that diff cover. You can go with a Dana 70 that's laid over and get a little bit more. Portal axles get even more. But high center is pretty tough because whatever hangs down here in the middle is what's going to be susceptible. We've done a couple of these Elite builds before, and we got a couple of choices. We can section this and drop it down. Now let me just say, if you look at Terramoto and some of these other builds, these are running old LS3s with 4L80s. They're basically race vehicles that get beat up out in the desert. If we talk about a full-size JK with air conditioning, cruise control, and all the other stuff, you're not going to build it to the same spec that you're going to build a race vehicle. And those guys have no compromise. They're running Excel gauges. They're not really too concerned about the electronics inside the cab. They just want to go fast. So we have to do somewhat of a compromise. And if this customer insists on having a flat belly, flat skids, then we're going to mount this transmission mount directly on top of here. We're going to run flat skids. We're going to have to wrap the pipes, keep the heat out. I've seen, and you see all this stuff he's got run here, I've seen the ARB lines in this plastic for lights and cameras literally melt when you have full skids and you don't wrap the exhaust pipes. It turns this space into an oven. So what are our options if we run the flat skid? Well, if this transmission hits the tunnel, and as you can see, his stock transmission was hitting the tunnel and he had a body lift already. So that tells me that we're going to have a issue. What we can do is obviously section the floor. We did that a few years ago, if you guys remember, on the build for Phil Howell at 4-Wheel Drive Magazine, where we sectioned the floor, let the transfer case stick up, and then we built a new floor, and that allowed him to run the flat skids that he wanted. So what it comes down to is how much time do you want to spend for the gain? Yes, you're going to pick up a couple of inches. There are companies that offer similar setups, but they're more traditional, where the cross member drops down and goes across, gives that transmission more clearance to the body, but they're losing a little bit of ground clearance. So it really comes down to what you want and how much money you want to spend. There's no doubt for a race setup, this is what you want. But this isn't exactly your average small block Chevy. This is a, I'm going to say, close to a 500 horsepower LT1 with a very sophisticated, I'm not sure, I think we're running the 8-speed in this one, not the 10 because it's a little bit stronger. So it's a very sophisticated powertrain. This guy's going to want everything to work: cruise control, tap shift, radio, everything else. All the things that these race rigs don't have. So there's going to be a compromise. And if you want to pay the money and the fabrication costs, then you can get what you want. And there's no doubt this is a beautiful chassis, and it's also a very expensive chassis. I've heard that you can have more than 200 hours of fabrication labor into a build like this. Now, if we look at the so-called bolt-on coilovers over there, they perform really good. Now, it's not going to perform as good as this, obviously, but the cost is just going to be a fraction of what this cost. So let's step to the back. I said I'd talk about the fuel tank. Has changed a lot over the years, and it's beautifully made, as you can see. These are our breathers. You notice they're relatively small. They're about 5/16, and they come up here, and then they tee into another 5/16 and go up to the evap canister up there. That's not a whole lot of venting for a tank this size. So when you start pushing fuel into this, now this is our fuel inlet breather, and in a factory setup, what happens is when you start pushing fuel in, there's pressure created, and this hose senses it. Now there's a feedback hose that goes to the top of your fuel tank, and obviously it's not present here because this tank doesn't have it. But what that does, a lot of guys think, oh, it's just a vent, and it's not. There's a fill valve inside here. So when there's enough differential pressure, the fill valve drops and it opens up a really big port that goes into the evap canister, and that allows you to push the fuel in quickly. With this setup, it's unlikely you're going to be able to push the fuel in quickly. You're probably going to have to dribble it in at a slower rate. We're also not going to be venting as efficiently as a factory tank because we don't have the size and the length of the original setup, meaning this is pretty small diameter hose. We've teamed them together and we're running them a long distance. The evap canister is right next to the tank on a stock JK, and we're running a larger 5/8 diameter vent. So that allows you to fill the tank faster and allows the bad gases or the evaporative emissions to be handled in a different way. So again, this is race technology that we're putting on the street. Another concern is the power to this fuel pump. Now, early on, I saw some of these extension harnesses, and they were small gauge wires. It looks like they did step them up here. So we're extending these wires from up there to back here, and in some cases when we ran dual tanks, where we ran this tank in conjunction with a factory tank, they would run the wires back from the pump back up to the cab and then back here again. You just got a lot of wire. So the current carrying capability of that wire just wasn't enough, especially to support a 500 horsepower LT1. So what we ended up doing was running relays right off the battery to power to the pumps, and then obviously triggering those off the factory fuel pump wires. And I would recommend you do that if you have a high horsepower engine or you have a tank that's located very far from the TIPM, which obviously this one is. Now, we're not using this fuel pump solely to drive this engine. Now, we're not using this fuel pump to power the LT solely. You got to remember, the LT is only using that pump as a feeder pump. The LS does use it as a primary pump. But the LT has a high pressure pump back here that produces thousands of pounds of pressure. Now, here's something I want to mention. Notice this has 3 wires on this fuel pressure sensor. If you got 3 wires, this is going to be a newer model engine, usually 17 or newer. I've seen some 16s with it too. If you got 4 wires here, it's going to be an early model engine. And that's important because if you got a 3-wire sensor, a 4-wire operating system, computer, wiring is not going to work for you. So you can switch things around and change parts, but just know this: if you got 3 wires, you most likely have a newer engine. If you have 4 wires, you most likely have an older engine. You want to stay with whatever you got. This is a GM Performance crate motor, so we have these awesome fabricated stainless headers, I guess I can call them, and they work really well. We got an oil cooler on this, which is going to come off, and then we're going to run our rail cooler over here. I'm pretty sure we'll come back throughout this build and check in on the progress.